No one expects a war story to begin with a smell. Not gunpowder, not smoke, not blood or burning cities, but the slow, heavy scent of warm gravy drifting through a wooden barracks. And yet for a group of German female prisoners of war in the final, collapsing months of the Second World War, that smell marked the exact moment when survival stopped being abstract and became physical again. Until then, survival had meant endurance without hope, hunger without end, and a body that no longer felt like it belonged to the person inside it. They had been trained to expect brutality from the enemy. They had been warned about American cruelty. They had rehearsed fear so many times that it had become instinct. What they were not prepared for was food that felt like home. Imagine the disorientation of that moment. You are exhausted beyond language. Your uniform hangs loosely on a body that has learned to shrink. Your stomach has been empty so long that pain has dulled into something quieter, more dangerous. You expect punishment. You expect cold efficiency. You expect the enemy to confirm everything the war has taught you to believe. Instead, you're handed a plate. Thick bread, pale, soft, unfamiliar, covered in a white sauce that smells rich, salty, almost absurdly comforting. Biscuits and gravy. A meal so ordinary to American soldiers that it barely registered as kindness. And yet to these women it felt like an interruption in reality. At first, many of them did not eat. Suspicion came before hunger. In war, nothing is given freely, especially by the enemy. They watched the guards. They watched each other. They waited for a consequence that did not come. The food did not disappear. No one shouted. No one laughed. The plate stayed warm in their hands. And in that stillness, something deeply unsettling happened. Their bodies reacted before their minds could catch up. Hands shook, breathing slowed, eyes filled with tears that made no sense in a prison camp. This was not relief yet. It was confusion, the kind that forces you to question everything you thought you understood about danger. The shock was not that the food existed. It was that it was meant for them, that it was prepared consistently, without ceremony, without cruelty attached. For women who had spent years navigating scarcity, ration cards, substitute ingredients, and the constant fear of deprivation, this meal violated the rules of wartime logic. It did not feel earned. It did not feel transactional. And that made it more powerful than any threat. The enemy was not behaving like an enemy. The war narrative they had carried inside them began to crack, not with ideology, but with warmth. Food in wartime is never just food. It is hierarchy. It is control. It is who gets to live another day with strength and who does not. For German civilians and soldiers alike, the late war years had turned eating into an act of calculation and guilt. Every bite carried awareness of absence elsewhere. For these women, many of whom had been swept into war service, auxiliary roles, factories, or medical units, hunger had been a constant companion. Hunger taught obedience. Hunger erased choice. Hunger made the future shrink until only the next hour mattered. By the time they were captured, many had already crossed a threshold where the body conserved energy by shutting down hope. That is why the biscuits and gravy mattered. Not because they were luxurious, but because they were reliable. They arrived again the next day, and the next. Warmth became predictable. Fat returned to bodies that had forgotten what it felt like to be nourished. Sleep deepened. The constant buzzing anxiety that comes from starvation began, slowly, to recede. But in this first moment, none of that was clear yet. All that existed was the plate, the smell, and the impossible realization that the rules had changed without explanation. Some of the women later recalled that the first bite felt overwhelming, almost frightening. Rich food, after long deprivation, can do that. It floods the system. It reminds the body of sensations it had been forced to forget. Chewing felt strange. Swallowing felt heavy. And yet they kept going because instinct overruled caution. Survival recognized opportunity before ideology could intervene. In that act, something deeply human asserted itself. Not gratitude yet, not trust, just a quiet surrender to nourishment. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because it forces a question that war does not like to ask. What happens when kindness appears where cruelty was expected? For these prisoners, kindness did not immediately feel good. It destabilized them. Hatred had structure. Fear had clarity. But this did not fit. It created cognitive dissonance at a moment when their minds were already fragile. Some women reportedly felt guilt for eating better as prisoners than their families might be eating back home. Others felt anger at how easily their bodies responded to care from the enemy. And some simply felt numb, unable to process anything beyond the physical act of being fed. The American guards did not deliver speeches. They did not explain the philosophy behind the meal. For many of them, biscuits and gravy were just efficient calories, cheap to produce, easy to serve in large quantities. Comfort food from home, replicated in a foreign place. That mundanity is precisely what made it revolutionary. There was no performative mercy, no moral lesson attached, just food placed in front of someone who needed it. In war, that simplicity can feel radical. This first encounter did not end the prisoner's fear. It did not erase trauma. It did not suddenly transform enemies into friends. But it marked the beginning of a psychological shift that would unfold quietly over days and weeks. The shock of the ordinary planted a seed. If this was possible, what else might be untrue about the stories they had been told? If survival could include warmth and care, even temporarily, then perhaps the future was not entirely closed. In later years, many of these women would struggle to explain why that meal stayed with them more vividly than liberation itself. They would remember the texture of the bread, the way steam rose from the plate, the moment when their hands stopped shaking. History tends to record battles and treaties, victories and defeats. But for those who lived inside collapse, meaning often returned in smaller, quieter forms. A spoon, a bowl, a taste that reminded the body it was still alive. And that is where this story truly begins, not with victory or surrender, but with a moment so ordinary it felt impossible. A meal that did not just feed bodies, but disrupted a war inside the mind. Long before the plate ever reached their hands, long before the smell of food disrupted expectation, the bodies and minds of these women had already been reshaped by a slow, grinding erosion that most histories compress into a single word: shortage. But shortage was not a number. It was not a statistic. It was a daily recalibration of what it meant to exist. 4 German women caught inside the machinery of a collapsing state. Hunger was not simply the absence of food. It was the presence of fear at every decision point, a constant negotiation between endurance and collapse that began years before capture and intensified as the war turned decisively against Germany. By the time Allied forces were advancing deep into German-held territory, the women who would later become prisoners were already living in a condition that modern observers would recognize as prolonged physiological stress. Many have been drafted into auxiliary military roles, industrial labor, communications, logistics, or medical support. Others have been displaced civilians pulled into the war effort by necessity rather than ideology. Their days were structured around air raid sirens, production quotas, curfews, and ration cards that promised sustenance but rarely delivered adequacy. Food had become symbolic as much as physical, a reminder of scarcity that seeped into conversation, posture, and thought. Rations diminished steadily as supply lines fractured. Protein became rare. Fats nearly vanished. Meals were stretched with substitutes that looked like food but behaved differently in the body. Bread extended with fillers. Coffee replaced by bitter imitations. Soups thinned until they were mostly water and memory. The body adapts to this, but at a cost. Weight loss was visible, but the deeper damage was invisible. Hormonal disruption, cognitive fatigue, emotional volatility. Hunger changes how the brain prioritizes. Long-term planning erodes. Empathy dulls. Fear sharpens. Survival becomes immediate, narrow, and isolating. For women, this stress was compounded by social expectation and silence. Complaining was dangerous. Weakness was suspect. Many carried responsibilities beyond themselves, caring for children, elders, or wounded soldiers while their own reserves depleted. Even those without dependents were expected to perform resilience. There was no space to collapse publicly. The war did not pause for exhaustion. It demanded output until the body failed or the front moved again. In this environment, hunger became internalized as normal. Pain dulled. Signals were ignored. The body learned to function on empty, and that adaptation, while remarkable, left little margin for shock. As Allied bombing intensified, the psychological toll accelerated. Sleep became fragmented. Nights were spent in shelters, underground, listening to cities disintegrate above. Days were spent repairing, cleaning, producing, repeating. Trauma accumulated without processing. For many women, capture did not arrive as a dramatic battlefield moment, but as an end to motion. A road cut off. A unit dissolved. Orders stopped coming. The state that had dictated every movement suddenly evaporated, leaving individuals suspended between danger and uncertainty. When American forces encountered these women, they did not meet an enemy in the conventional sense. They met people already stripped down to core survival behaviors. Suspicion was high, not because of fanaticism alone, but because trust had become dangerous. Any deviation from expectation could mean punishment. Any mistake could mean starvation. Many had seen or heard of reprisals, both real and exaggerated, and propaganda had ensured that the image of capture was terrifying. The fear was not abstract. It was embodied. Muscles tightened reflexively. Speech became guarded. Eye contact was measured. By the time they were processed into camps, these women were already at a breaking point that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with biology. Chronic undernourishment alters perception. It heightens threat detection. It narrows emotional range. It can produce irritability, withdrawal, and a profound sense of unreality. Many prisoners later described feeling detached from their own bodies, as if watching themselves move through events from a distance. This dissociation was not weakness. It was a protective response to prolonged stress with no clear endpoint. Food scarcity had also eroded identity. In peacetime, meals anchor social roles. Who cooks? Who eats first? What is shared? What is celebrated? In wartime Germany, those rituals collapsed. Eating became mechanical, private, Schemeladen. The inability to feed oneself adequately produces a quiet humiliation that accumulates over time. For women raised in a culture that tied domestic competence and care to self-worth, this loss cut deeply. They could not fulfill the most basic expression of normalcy. They could not nourish others. Sometimes they could barely nourish themselves. This erosion mattered because it set the stage for how captivity would be experienced. When you have already been living in deprivation, capture does not immediately feel like a change. It feels like a continuation under new management. The fear is not that things will get worse. It is that they will stay the same indefinitely. That hunger will follow you across uniforms, borders, and languages. That the body will simply continue shrinking until it disappears. Many of the women carried additional layers of trauma that history rarely isolates. Some had fled advancing fronts, witnessing violence, displacement, and death at close range. Others had survived sexual threat, coercion, or abuse, risks that increased as social order disintegrated. Silence was the default response. Survival depended on not standing out. By the time they were taken into custody, these women were not just hungry. They were hypervigilant. Every interaction was scanned for danger. Every kindness was suspect. The American camps they entered were not immediately understood as safer spaces. Barbed wire looks the same no matter who controls it. Guards carry weapons regardless of language. Orders shouted in unfamiliar accents still trigger compliance. The body does not differentiate between captors based on moral nuance. It reacts to constraint. And for women whose autonomy had already been eroded, captivity threatened to complete the process. It is important to understand that at this stage, hope was not an active emotion. Hope requires energy. It requires imagination. Hunger suppresses both. Many prisoners later recalled that they did not think about the future at all. They focused on minutes, on posture, on conserving warmth, on not attracting attention. This psychological narrowing is a hallmark of survival under extreme conditions. It allows endurance, but it also makes transformation difficult. When everything is reduced to immediate threat management, there is little room for reinterpretation. This is why the context before the meal matters so deeply. Without understanding the depth of depletion, it is impossible to grasp the impact of what followed. The women who would later associate biscuits and gravy with survival were not simply hungry. They were physiologically compromised, emotionally exhausted, and cognitively constricted. Their bodies had been trained by scarcity to distrust abundance. Their minds had been trained by propaganda and experience to distrust the enemy. Any deviation from expectation would not be processed gently. It would collide with systems already under strain. Even the act of standing in line for food had become loaded with anxiety during the war. Lines meant scarcity. They meant calculation. They meant the possibility of running out before your turn. They meant judgment from others watching portion sizes. These patterns did not disappear upon capture. The women carried them into the camps, expecting the same dynamics to play out under different flags. The idea that food could be consistent, sufficient, and non-punitive was not just foreign. It was almost unthinkable. There was also the weight of guilt. Many prisoners were acutely aware that while they were alive, others were not. That while they might eat, families back home might starve. This guilt was not abstract. It manifested physically, tightening throats, spoiling appetite, complicating relief. Hunger and guilt often coexist in war, creating a paradox where nourishment feels undeserved. This emotional conflict further delayed any sense of safety. Before capture, these women had also internalized a specific understanding of power. Power was coercive. Power took. Power demanded. Power did not care. This worldview was reinforced daily by the war machine that consumed labor, bodies, and resources without apology. To survive within it, one learned to comply, to minimize visibility, to endure. There was no precedent for power expressed through care. That concept had been hollowed out by years of violence and deprivation. As the war reached its final stages, rumors spread faster than food. Stories of camps, reprisals, revenge circulated among civilians and retreating units alike. Some were exaggerated. Some were true. The uncertainty amplified fear. For women, the fear of capture included gendered threats that were rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt. Protection strategies were improvised. Alliances formed and dissolved quickly. Trust became provisional. When American forces finally took custody, the immediate priority for the prisoners was not ideological reconciliation. It was bodily survival. Would there be enough water? Would there be shelter? Would there be food? And if there's food, what kind? How much? How often? These questions dominated thought because they had dominated life for years. The answer to those questions would determine not just physical health, but psychological trajectory. At this stage, before the meal, the women existed in a liminal state. The old system had collapsed, but nothing new had stabilized yet. This in-between is where the human nervous system is most fragile. Expectations are suspended. Defenses are high. Any signal can tip the balance toward recovery or deeper withdrawal. In such moments, small interventions can have outsized effects, not because they're dramatic, but because they intersect with systems already pushed to the edge. This is the condition in which the plate would eventually arrive, not as an isolated kindness, but as a shock to a body and mind conditioned by years of deprivation, fear, and silence. The power of that moment did not come from novelty alone. It came from contrast, from the distance between what had been endured and what was suddenly possible. To understand the transformation that followed, one must first sit with this before, with the hunger that was no longer sharp but hollow, with the exhaustion that no longer protested but complied, with the women who had learned to survive by expecting nothing, and who would soon be confronted with something they had not allowed themselves to imagine. And in that fragile space, where expectation had been reduced to the bare minimum, the stage was set for a change that would ripple far beyond a single meal, precisely because it arrived when the body was most in need of proof that survival could still include care. The shift did not announce itself with ceremony. There was no declaration that life had entered a new phase, no formal acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed. Instead, transformation began quietly, inside bodies that had been trained for years to expect loss. It unfolded in increments so small that at first they barely registered, like warmth spreading through numb fingers. What altered the trajectory of these women's captivity was not ideology, not interrogation, not even freedom itself, but the repeated, almost banal experience of being fed in a way that restored rather than merely sustained. To understand why this mattered, it is necessary to look closely at what those meals did inside the body. Long-term undernourishment does not simply reduce weight. It recalibrates the entire system. Metabolism slows. Hormonal balance fractures. The nervous system remains in a constant state of alert, interpreting even neutral stimuli as potential threats. When adequate food re-enters such a system, the effect is not instant pleasure. It is adjustment. At first, the body resists. Rich food can feel overwhelming, even painful. But when nourishment arrives consistently, something profound begins to happen beneath conscious awareness. Blood sugar stabilizes. Sleep deepens. Cortisol levels drop. The brain regains access to functions that hunger had suppressed. For the German female prisoners, this process began not with abstract nutrition charts, but with a rhythm. Meals arrived at predictable times. Portions were sufficient. The taste was unfamiliar, heavy, rich in fat and salt, a stark contrast to the thin, improvised wartime diet they had endured. Biscuits and gravy, for American soldiers, were utilitarian comfort food. For the prisoners, they were an intrusion into the logic of deprivation. The body did not care about symbolism. It recognized calories. It recognized warmth. It recognized consistency. And slowly it responded. Within days, subtle changes emerged. Women who had slept lightly, waking at every sound, began to rest more deeply. The constant ache in joints softened. The dizziness that accompanied standing eased. These physical shifts had psychological consequences. Hunger narrows attention, forcing the mind to fixate on immediate need. As that pressure eased, attention widened. Thoughts lengthened. Memories sharpened. The world began to feel less distant, less dreamlike. This was not joy. It was clarity returning after years of fog. What made this transformation particularly powerful was that it occurred without explicit intent. The American guards and camp administrators did not design the meals as psychological interventions. They were logistical solutions, efficient ways to feed large numbers of people. And yet, precisely because the care was not dramatized, it bypassed defenses. There was no demand for gratitude, no expectation of ideological conversion, no overt moral lesson. The prisoners were not being taught anything. They were being sustained. That distinction mattered. As nourishment restored physical stability, it created space for emotional responses that had been suppressed. Some women found themselves crying without understanding why. Others felt sudden waves of anger or sadness triggered by small things, a sound, a smell, a remembered phrase. These reactions were signs of reawakening. Trauma often remains dormant when survival demands all available energy. When the body begins to feel safer, that stored material surfaces. The meals did not erase trauma. They unlocked it. And in doing so, they marked a turning point. The act of eating together also altered social dynamics within the camps. During the war, scarcity had fostered competition and withdrawal. Now, shared meals reintroduced a sense of collective experience. Conversations resumed, tentative at first, then more fluid. Women compared impressions of the food, speculated about ingredients, laughed quietly at misunderstandings. These interactions, trivial on the surface, rebuilt social muscles that had atrophied under stress. Connection returned not through grand reconciliation, but through the simple act of sitting together and eating. It is important to note that this process was uneven. Not all prisoners experienced relief in the same way or at the same pace. Some remained deeply guarded, interpreting the food as temporary, even manipulative. Others struggled with guilt, feeling unworthy of care, while loved ones back home likely continue to suffer. Nourishment did not automatically produce trust, but it did create conditions in which trust could eventually emerge. It softened the internal environment enough for new interpretations to become possible. For many women, the most disorienting aspect was the realization that the enemy was not behaving as expected. Propaganda had painted Americans as brutal, decadent, morally corrupt. The reality they encountered did not align neatly with that image. Guards were not universally kind. Camps were still restrictive. Power imbalances remained stark. But the presence of consistent care complicated the narrative. The mind, once freed from the immediate tyranny of hunger, began to reconcile contradictions. That reconciliation was psychologically demanding. It required the reevaluation of deeply held beliefs formed under extreme pressure. This cognitive shift was not about admiration or allegiance. It was about nuance. Hunger enforces binaries. You're either fed or starving, safe or endangered, alive or not. As those binaries softened, complexity re-entered perception. The enemy became human, not in an abstract moral sense, but in a practical one. Humans feed other humans. Humans maintain routines. Humans perform mundane acts that have unintended consequences. This realization did not erase resentment or pain, but it destabilized absolute hostility. The food also altered the guards' perceptions. American soldiers, many of them young, far from home, encountered prisoners who did not fit the caricatures they had absorbed. Women exhausted, quiet, responding visibly to care. The shared environment of the mess hall became a space where roles blurred slightly. Not enough to dissolve hierarchy, but enough to introduce hesitation. When a guard sees the impact of a simple meal on someone who had been reduced to scarcity, it can recalibrate their own understanding of power. Authority exercised through provision feels different than authority exercised through force. Physiologically, the return of adequate nutrition restored agency in subtle ways. Hunger strips choice. When every thought is about food, autonomy collapses. As that pressure eased, women regained the capacity to make decisions beyond immediate survival. They could choose when to speak, when to rest, when to engage. This reemergence of agency was fragile, but significant. It marked a departure from the totalizing control of deprivation. Some women later recalled that the most profound change was not feeling full, but feeling time stretch again. Under hunger, time compresses. The future disappears. Days blur. With nourishment, days differentiated. Mornings felt distinct from evenings. The anticipation of the next meal created rhythm. Rhythm created orientation. Orientation created the possibility of imagining beyond the present moment. This was not hope in the grand sense. It was something quieter. The ability to imagine that tomorrow might resemble today, and that today was survivable. The unintended weapon here was not kindness in the sentimental sense. It was stability. War thrives on instability, on the constant disruption of expectation. By introducing predictability, the camps disrupted the psychological mechanisms that sustain enemy narratives. The women were no longer solely reacting. They were adjusting. That adjustment required cognitive resources that hunger had previously monopolized. Once freed, those resources turned inward, processing experience, reassessing meaning. This is where nourishment intersects with dignity. Being fed adequately communicates, without words, that one's life is worth sustaining. Even in captivity, that message resonates. For women whose worth had been measured in output, obedience, or sacrifice, this implicit valuation was destabilizing. It challenged internalized beliefs about expendability. It suggested, however faintly, that survival did not have to be justified. The transformation was not linear. Setbacks occurred. News from home could re-traumatize. Uncertainty about the future lingered. Liberation was still distant. But the baseline had shifted. The body, no longer in crisis mode, allowed the mind to engage with reality differently. This difference would shape how these women experienced the remainder of captivity and, later, repatriation. In later interviews and memoirs, many struggled to articulate why food occupied such a central place in their memory of captivity. It seemed trivial compared to the scale of destruction they had witnessed. And yet, when asked to identify the moment when they realized they might survive, they did not point to a battle ending or a flag changing. They pointed to the return of appetite, to the ability to finish a meal, to the absence of fear while eating. This speaks to a broader truth about human resilience. Survival is not sustained by heroism alone. It is sustained by systems that restore the body enough for the mind to function. In extreme conditions, morality often collapses into logistics. Who eats? Who sleeps? Who warms? Who heals? The American biscuits and gravy were not symbols of benevolence in the abstract. They were practical interventions that altered internal states. In doing so, they shifted psychological trajectories. The unintended consequence of this nourishment was not gratitude toward captors, but the reemergence of selfhood among the prisoners. Selfhood requires energy. It requires the capacity to reflect, to remember, to feel beyond immediate pain. Hunger suppresses that capacity. Feeding restores it. Once restored, it can lead to outcomes that power structures cannot fully control. Reflection breeds questioning. Questioning breeds complexity. Complexity undermines simplistic narratives. As weeks passed, the women began to speak of the food less in terms of surprise and more in terms of normalcy. This transition is telling. The extraordinary becomes ordinary when the body accepts safety as baseline. At that point, nourishment no longer dominates consciousness. It supports it. That is the point at which deeper psychological work begins, often involuntarily. This part of the story is uncomfortable because it reveals how fragile ideological constructs are when confronted with basic human needs. Years of propaganda, fear, and training could not compete indefinitely with consistent care. Not because care was morally superior in a grand sense, but because it addressed needs that ideology ignores. Hunger does not argue. It demands. Once satisfied, it relinquishes control, and the mind regains sovereignty. The biscuits and gravy did not end the war. They did not absolve anyone of responsibility. They did not rewrite history. But they altered individual lives in ways that rippled outward. They restored bodies enough for minds to engage with reality beyond survival. They introduced stability into chaos. They demonstrated, unintentionally, that power exercised through provision has different consequences than power exercised through deprivation. This transformation set the stage for the next phase of the story, where kindness would reveal its complexity and danger. Because once survival is no longer the only goal, questions emerge. About loyalty, about guilt, about identity, about what it means to accept care from an enemy. Nourishment opened the door to those questions. And once opened, they cannot easily be closed. The kindness embodied in those meals, the warmth, the routine, the nourishment that arrived without condition, began to create a psychological tension that few could have anticipated. In the space between deprivation and care, something unexpected emerged. While it provided temporary relief, it also stirred something deeper in the women who ate it, a profound internal conflict. Could kindness from an enemy ever be accepted without compromising the self? Could humanity, once defined by survival, now incorporate a different form of agency, one that allowed space for compassion without eroding the basic tenets of identity? In the weeks that followed, the simple act of being fed became a source of tension. These women, who had spent the better part of their adult lives aligning themselves with an ideology, whether willingly or out of necessity, were now faced with an incongruity that none of their training had prepared them for. In a war where survival often meant denying the humanity of the enemy, what did it mean when the enemy fed you? What did it mean when the enemy treated you with care, with consistency, with basic decency? This was the very paradox that began to unearth the cracks in the ideological armor that had been constructed around them. The German female prisoners, conditioned by years of propaganda and wartime hardship, had long been taught to view the Allies, particularly the Americans, as corrupt, decadent, and above all brutal. These teachings had been drilled into them through films, pamphlets, and official narratives that depicted the Allies as morally inferior, driven by an insatiable thirst for power and destruction. They were trained to see the world through this lens, with no room for ambiguity or nuance. But the reality they faced inside the camp contradicted everything they had been taught. In the very space where they had expected to encounter further degradation, where they thought the worst had already happened, they found not just sustenance, but a new form of interaction, one that was both human and unsettling. They were being fed not as enemies to be subjugated, but as people in need of care. This was a dissonance that rattled the walls of their convictions. One of the most profound consequences of this meal routine was the internal rift it caused. Many of the women, despite the clear physical benefits of being well fed, struggled to accept the basic reality of their circumstances. The food was provided by the same forces that had been responsible for the destruction of their cities, their homes, their families. How could they reconcile that? How could they simply accept that the same soldiers who had been fighting against them for years were now offering them nourishment, something so simple yet so powerful in its impact? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could an enemy that had killed their soldiers, bombed their homes, and stripped their nation of its dignity turn around and offer them biscuits and gravy without strings attached? The very act of being fed by their captors, a process that was intended to help them regain strength, became a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided them with the physical ability to survive. On the other hand, it forced them to confront a question they were not prepared to answer. How could they trust these men when they had been taught that they were their enemy? As these women wrestled with the cognitive dissonance of being fed by their enemies, they found themselves in a state of limbo. The power dynamics in the camp were clear. The guards, although sometimes kind, were still in charge. They had weapons, and they held the key to their fate. But that power, so absolute in other contexts, had been undermined by the simplicity of shared meal. The guards did not simply wield authority through force or intimidation. In the context of food, they exercised power through care and provision, a far more insidious kind of control that made the women question their understanding of power itself. At first, the women could not reconcile this shift. Their instincts told them to mistrust it. The act of feeding was not only a matter of survival. It was a gesture that carried emotional and psychological weight. To accept it was to acknowledge that they were vulnerable, that they were at the mercy of others. But in doing so, they were also forced to recognize that their captors were in some way human. They could not fully escape this reality. The emotional contradiction was too great. Some women, unable to process this tension, refused to engage with the kindness. They rejected the food. They turned away from it, refusing to give in to what they saw as a manipulation. The act of eating from the hands of their enemy, in their minds, would erase the lines between them. They could not afford to let their guards down, even for a moment. This rejection was an attempt to maintain some control, to preserve their autonomy in the face of overwhelming external forces. Others, more desperate, or perhaps more open to the experience, embraced the food. They ate with no reservations, allowing themselves to feel the simple pleasure of being nourished. They experienced moments of temporary peace in the act of eating. But that peace, too, came at a cost. The women who accepted the food had to confront the guilt of their own survival. How could they feel relief when so many others had not made it this far? How could they enjoy a meal while their country, still in the throes of war, suffered? The internal conflict this created was immense. Many spoke later of a profound sense of shame, as though their physical survival had been purchased at the price of moral compromise. What emerged from this was a complicated emotional landscape. The women could not remain static in their internal battle. As the days and weeks passed, the act of eating began to symbolize something greater than sustenance. It symbolized a choice. Could they remain rigid in their hostility, or could they begin to imagine the possibility of connection, even with their captors? For many, this was an unimaginable idea. To forgive, to accept care, to see the humanity in the enemy. These were not small steps. But as they ate, they began to question whether there was any room for these possibilities within the confines of their own survival. And yet, as much as food transformed them physically, it also transformed their relationships with one another. In war, survival often means isolation. But in the camp, the shared experience of being fed, of eating together, of being treated with a kind of dignity that had been denied to them for years, created new bonds. These women, who had been strangers when they first arrived, began to see each other in a new light. They shared not just food, but stories, laughter, and the kind of quiet solidarity that only emerges in extreme circumstances. They could not change the fact that they were prisoners, but they could create moments of humanity within that system. But even in these moments of connection, there remained an underlying tension. The shared meals did not erase the physical and emotional distance between them and their captors. The guard may have fed them, but they remained in control. The power dynamics could not be ignored, no matter how comforting the food was. And yet, as the women spent more time together, they began to engage in conversations that slowly chipped away at the enemy's dehumanization. They spoke of the food, of the small acts of kindness that began to emerge, but they also spoke of the things they would never forget. The memory of destruction, of violence, of death, it could not be erased by biscuits and gravy. The women who accepted the food were not simply forgiving their captors. They were engaging in a far more complex process. They were choosing survival, choosing to hold onto something human within themselves, despite the overwhelming forces at play. They were rejecting the narrative that war had taught them, that their captors were enemies to be destroyed, and instead, they were forging new definitions of what it meant to be human in a time of unimaginable conflict. This emotional journey did not happen overnight. The acceptance of care from an enemy is not a simple, linear process. It is one filled with hesitation, doubt, and often profound moral questioning. And yet, for those who chose to accept it, the act of eating, of being fed by the enemy, became a symbol of the possibility of a different future, a future where humanity could not only survive war, but emerge from it altered, perhaps even reconciled. As these women struggled with the moral and emotional implications of their survival, they were also faced with an unspoken question. What would happen after the war? Would they return to a world where the enemy was still the enemy, where the ideology that had driven them for years would still define them? Or would they, too, be transformed by the same kindness that had temporarily redefined their relationship with survival? For now, though, they ate. They ate because their bodies demanded it, because survival still had to be maintained, because the future was uncertain, and because, in that moment, food was the one thing they could rely on. But in doing so, they began to acknowledge that even survival had its cost, that the transformation wrought by food was not just physical, but psychological and emotional, a transformation that would shape the way they remembered the war and the way they moved forward into a world forever changed.